I'm Megan Carlisle, 33 years old, a flight operations planner who has spent most of her adult life charting other people's routes, while my own family barely noticed mine. I walked into the Carlisle reunion with the same steady breath I use before a long-haul disruption briefing, reminding myself I was here because my mother insisted that showing up meant we were still a unit. I didn't believe that, but I showed up anyway, hoping silence counted as neutrality. I had barely reached the refreshment table when my cousin Kendra brushed past me and slipped a folded note into my hand without a word. I opened it, expecting a joke, but instead found a screenshot from our family group chat, the one where I had shared the biggest update of my year. My text sat there bright and open, and beneath it was the single response from my parents, a thumbs-up emoji. Nothing more. The image was cropped close, like Kendra wanted me to see only what mattered. And for a moment, I wondered why she had chosen this day to remind me. The answer formed before I could stop it. Something was about to crack in this family. And she knew it. I tucked the note into my pocket just as my mother, Diane, spotted me and waved with the buoyant enthusiasm she reserved for public gatherings, calling out that she was thrilled I made it. Beside her, my sister Brianna adjusted her sunglasses and announced to anyone listening that she had stories from her recent wellness retreat, promising it had changed her life. I smiled, the kind of smile that keeps a room calm even when your chest tightens. I already sensed the familiar pattern falling into place. Before I could step away, Kendra reappeared beside me long enough to murmur that she thought I should see the screenshot before the day unfolded any further. Her eyes flicking toward the pavilion where my parents arranged platters as if orchestrating a show. I thanked her quietly, unsure whether gratitude or dread was supposed to come first. Then I stood still, the note warm in my hand, realizing it wasn't a warning. It was context. Something in this reunion would hinge on the difference between being present and being seen. My mother, Diane, stood near the long row of tables, telling anyone within earshot. I've been planning this reunion since January. I swear I talked to every cousin twice just to get them here. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle on the bright banner with our family name and laughed, adding, "But it's worth it. Look at this turnout. This is what family is supposed to look like." An aunt told her she outdid herself this year, and Diane replied, "Well, when your youngest is thriving the way Brianna is, you celebrate properly." I poured myself lemonade I didn't really want and listened to my own name never come up. Brianna was holding court under the shade of an oak tree, phone in hand, the screen angled toward a circle of aunts and cousins who leaned in like she was premiering a film. "This was the view from my room," she said, flicking to a photo of mountains and infinity pool. 3 massages in 4 days. I swear my spine has forgiven me for existing. Someone whistled and she grinned. Scrolling again. The package was insane. Daily breakfast in bed. Sunset tasting menu. The whole thing comped as an early 31st birthday gift. Mom and Dad said they wanted me to finally feel spoiled. The women around her told her she deserved it. Their voices warm and unanimous. Diane drifted over and wrapped an arm around Brianna's shoulders, proudly announcing, "Our girl works so hard. We just wanted to give her something she'd remember for the rest of her life." Brianna laughed and said, "You did. Believe me, I'm ruined for normal hotels now." My father, Thomas, joined them long enough to say, "She's always had an eye for the good stuff. Even as a kid, she knew what she liked." And everyone chuckled as if it were proof of destiny. I stood a few steps away with my plastic cup, close enough to hear every compliment, far enough that no one felt obliged to draw me into the circle. An older cousin I barely recognized asked, "And what about your other daughter? Is she here yet?" And Diane answered quickly, "Megan's around somewhere. But Brianna almost didn't make it because work has her so in demand lately." Brianna shrugged modestly and said, "It's just brand partnerships. Nothing glamorous. But my boss keeps putting me on the fun accounts and I'm not mad about it. The cousin nodded and told her, "You're on the right track, sweetheart. This is your time." And my mother echoed, "Exactly. This is her season. She's really coming into her own." I swallowed another sip of lemonade and reminded myself I was too old to be surprised. That was when my Uncle Greg appeared at my elbow. His voice warm and easy as he said, "There you are, kiddo. I was starting to think the airline grounded you." I smiled for real for the first time that day and told him, "They tried. But I swapped shifts so I could make this. Figured Grandma Ruth would hunt me down if I skipped." He laughed and answered, "She would. And so would I. You know, I don't miss a chance to brag that my niece keeps half the flights in the country on schedule." In that small pocket of conversation, with his attention squarely on me, I felt the sharp contrast between being noticed and simply being present. Greg stayed beside me, took one look at the way Brianna's circle had swelled, then turned back and said, "Forget their spa stories. How's that place in Savannah treating you? The one with the wraparound porch you showed me." I blinked once and answered, "You mean my house?" And he nodded enthusiastically, adding, "Yeah, the old place, with the wide front steps and those windows you were obsessed with." "Did you ever finish the work on the front room?" I said. "I did. The front room is done. The paint finally looks the way I wanted it to." And his voice floated out far enough that the nearby tables could hear every word. A cousin at the end of the bench glanced over. Then another. The way people do when they realize a conversation doesn't fit the script they're used to. Greg, oblivious to the subtle shift, kept going, telling me, "I've been bragging on you at the shop. You know, I told my crew my niece went and grabbed herself a real Savannah gem instead of waiting 10 years like the rest of us." I gave him a small smile and said, "You're generous. I just found something solid and took the chance." And he replied, "You're the only one in this family who would fly between hubs all week and then spend weekends sanding trim." A laugh escaped me because he wasn't wrong. And he added, "You sent me those photos of the staircase after you stripped it. That rail has good bones. You did right, not tearing it out." By then, the hum of conversation around us had thinned, and I could feel more than a few sets of eyes start to settle on my end of the table. My mother's voice cut in from behind me, sharp with surprise as she asked, "What house are you talking about?" And Greg turned, smiling, to answer, "Megan's house in Savannah. The historic one she closed on this year." Diane looked from him to me and said, "Megan doesn't have a house in Savannah," as if stating a fact she had already verified. I met her stare and replied, "I do. Actually," keeping my tone even. Across from me, my father Thomas stopped mid-reach for a plate and said slowly, "You bought a house," the words landing like he was tasting them for the first time. Brianna's phone lowered a fraction as someone near her repeated, "House in Savannah," and Greg finally registered the strain in the air. "You all didn't know?" he asked, eyebrows lifting, and then he looked back at me. "You told me you closed on that place months ago. You sent inspection photos and everything," he said, confusion creeping into his voice. I nodded once and answered, "I did. Uncle Greg. I closed. I moved in. I started fixing it up." The families at the surrounding tables went quiet enough that the only thing I could clearly hear was my own heartbeat. Brianna was the first to find her voice, her tone sharp as she asked, "How did you even buy a house? Where did you get that kind of money?" I looked at her and said, "From my job. The one I've had for years. Flight operations pays well when you move up and stay put." She frowned and said, "You never said you were making real money. I thought you were just scheduling things." searching for a word that made sense to her. Last year I made around $185,000 base with about $40,000 in bonus. I replied evenly. I've been promoted more than once. I didn't hide that. I just stopped repeating myself when no one listened. My mother shook her head like she could undo the last few minutes and said, "If you were doing that well, why didn't you tell us?" "Megan," my father added. "Exactly. You never called and said, 'Hey, I'm buying a house.' This is the first we're hearing about any of it." I slid my phone out of my pocket and answered, "That's not true. I called you 3 times the day I closed. And when you didn't pick up, I texted." I tapped the screen a few times and angled it toward them. "Here," I said. "Call log. 3 outgoing calls. All to the house. All on the day I signed." Thomas squinted at the screen and muttered, "We must have been busy that day." As if the missed calls were a clerical error, Diane's voice climbed as she insisted. "If this were that important, you could have just kept trying. You make it sound like we hung up on you on purpose." I took the phone back, opened the family group chat, and scrolled to the screenshot Kendra had shown me. After the calls went to voicemail, I said, "I sent this text. I closed on my house today in Savannah. I'm so excited. I can't wait to show you." I held the phone where they and half the table could see. My message bright on the screen followed by the single reaction beneath it. 5 hours later, I continued. The only response I got from either of you was this little thumbs up icon. Marilyn, my aunt, leaned closer and whispered. That's really all they wrote, but no one answered her. My mother stared at the phone, cheeks flushing, and said, "We didn't mean it like that. We thought we'd talk to you properly later." Things got hectic with Brianna's trip. I shook my head once and said, "You found time to book flights and tasting menus and spa appointments. But not even one sentence when your other daughter told you she bought a house." I let the silence hang for a beat, then said, "If you're this shocked I own a house, you could come see it instead of arguing about whether it exists." Diane stared at me like I was speaking another language. And I added, "Savannah is not on the moon. There are direct flights every day. You've flown farther for less important reasons." Greg nodded and said, "I'd come down again in a heartbeat. That place has real potential, and I'd love to see what you've done with it since the inspection." I looked at the cluster of faces around the table and said, "If you genuinely care, then come to my house and listen there." Grandma Ruth shifted in her chair and said, "I would like that. Megan, I want to see the home you worked for." Her voice cutting cleaner than anyone else's. Marilyn glanced between my parents and me and said, "It would be good for all of us to see it. To understand what you've been building." Kendra murmured, "I've never been to Savannah, but I'd go." And Greg added, "Pick a weekend and I'll make sure the dates work on my end." I nodded and said, "All right. Then let's stop pretending this is hypothetical." Thomas cleared his throat and asked, "What exactly are you asking us to do?" And I answered, "Come to Savannah in the next few weeks. Sit in my living room, and let me talk without cutting me off or changing the subject to Brianna." Diane said quickly, "We can make a family trip out of it. It'll be fun. We'll all see your little project and make a weekend of it." I met her eyes and replied, "You can call it whatever you need to. But in my house, I decide what it's for." Grandma Ruth looked straight at my parents and said, "I will be there. And I expect both of you to be there too. No excuses this time." A few weeks later, they came to Savannah like we had agreed. And I drove them from the airport through streets lined with old brick and overgrown trees until my house came into view. I had painted the exterior a soft blue-gray that worked with the original trim. And the wide front steps still creaked in the same spots they had the first time I walked them. So this is it, Brianna said quietly as she got out of the car, her voice missing the easy bravado she'd had at the reunion. My parents stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking in the porch, the tall windows, the front door I had refinished by hand. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon oil and old wood, the kind of clean that comes from scrubbing surfaces you actually care about. Greg stepped in after them and ran his fingers lightly along the banister before saying, "You were absolutely right not to rip this out. This rail is better than anything new you could have bought." Grandma Ruth followed more slowly, looking around the entryway and up toward the high ceilings without saying anything at first. When she finally spoke, she said, "You did all this yourself." Megan and I answered, "Yes, with contractors for the heavy work. But the choices are mine." We moved farther into the house, the group spreading just enough for everyone to see without bumping shoulders. The floorboards had been sanded and sealed, and the light through the front windows fell exactly where I'd hoped it would when I chose the stain. Thomas glanced at the doorway to the front room and said, "This is bigger than I pictured when Greg said old place." "I thought you meant some small starter spot." Diane traced the edge of a built-in shelf with her fingertips and said softly, "I didn't realize it would look like this." We gathered in the living room, and Grandma Ruth eased herself into one of the chairs, looking around slowly before saying, "You really made a home here. Megan, did you do all of this without your parents ever coming to see it?" I answered. "Yes, ma'am. This is the first time they've walked through the door." Greg sat on the arm of the sofa and added, "She sent me photos at every stage. I kept telling her this place was something to be proud of." Brianna stayed near the doorway, arms folded, her gaze moving from the ceiling moldings down to the rug like she was still trying to reconcile the picture in front of her with the version of me she thought she knew. Marilyn cleared her throat and said, "Seeing this all at once makes a lot of other things harder to ignore," her eyes shifting to Diane and Thomas. My mother bristled and asked, "What is that supposed to mean?" Marilyn and my aunt replied, "It means I've watched Megan try to talk about her job and her life at holidays. And every single time, someone cut her off to ask Brianna about something else." Kendra, standing near the bookshelf, added quietly, "I've noticed it too. It's why I kept that screenshot from the group chat." Diane shook her head as if the room were tilting and said, "You're all rewriting history. If Megan wanted us to really understand what was happening in her life, she should have pushed harder. She knows how busy we've been." I looked at her and said, "I called. I texted. I invited. The part where you pick up or respond was never mine to do." Thomas spread his hands and said, "We didn't realize you took it this way. If it hurt you, why didn't you just say so outright?" I gestured lightly to the walls around us and answered, "Buying a house and telling you I bought a house is as outright as it gets." Grandma Ruth leaned forward, her hands on her knees, and said, "Diane, Tom, your daughter owns this place, pays for this place, and filled it with her work. And you are standing here surprised because you weren't listening when she tried to share." My mother's eyes filled as she protested. "We were focused on Brianna because she needed support. She was juggling so much. You were always so independent. Megan, we thought you were fine," I said. "You used my independence as an excuse to ignore me. And then you called it a compliment." Brianna spoke for the first time since we arrived, murmuring, "I didn't know any of this. I didn't realize how lopsided it looked from where you were standing." Thomas looked around the room like he was suddenly seeing it as evidence and said, "We're here now. That has to count for something. We came. We showed up. That has to mean we care," I replied. Showing up after you've been embarrassed in front of the family is not the same thing as showing up because you're curious about my life. Diane snapped, "That's not fair." And I answered, "What's not fair is you standing in my living room, surrounded by proof that I've been building something for years, and still asking why I didn't drag you along every step." The house was quiet enough that the only sounds were our voices and the faint creak of the floor beneath our feet. I took a breath and said, "Let me make this very simple. Because this house makes everything harder to spin." I looked from my father to my mother and added, "You didn't know I owned a home because you never asked where I lived. You treated that detail like background noise." I held up my phone again and said, "When I told you I closed, you gave me a thumbs up emoji instead of a sentence. And that is exactly how it felt. Like my life was something you could react to with a sticker." I glanced toward the doorway where Brianna hovered and finished. "And the rest of you heard me get talked over for years and chose not to say anything. Which is how silence turned into permission." Thomas rubbed his forehead and said, "We hear you. Okay. We get it. We messed up. But we are standing in your living room right now. Isn't that proof we're trying to fix it?" I answered. "You're standing in my living room because the rest of the family watched you find out about this house at a picnic. Not because you woke up missing me and booked a flight." Diane said, "That's not fair. Megan, you make it sound like we don't love you. And that's just not true." Her voice catching on the word, I replied, "I'm not saying you don't feel love. I'm saying you didn't act like it when it mattered. And feelings without follow-through don't land the way you think they do." Marilyn spoke up again and said, "I should have called this out sooner. I saw it and kept my mouth shut. And that's on me." Kendra nodded beside her and added, "Same here." I kept that screenshot because it bothered me more than I knew how to say out loud. Greg looked at my parents and said, "I told my crew at work about this place before your own parents saw pictures. That shouldn't be how this goes." Grandma Ruth watched all of us and finally said, "Owning a home is not a small thing, and a child should not have to beg her parents to take interest." Thomas exhaled and said, "All right. We can't go back and redo any of that. But we can try to be better from here. Just tell us what you want." I shook my head slightly and said, "I don't want you to just try in the vague way you've always promised to try. I need specific things or this doesn't change." Diane's eyes were wet as she asked, "What specific things? What would it even look like for you to believe we care?" I answered. "For starters, one scheduled call a month where you actually pick up. Talk to me. And don't end it the second Brianna walks into the room." I went on. "Second, when I'm talking, you don't pivot to asking Brianna about her latest project or apartment decor. You let one conversation finish before you start another." Brianna glanced at our parents and then back at me. And I added, "If you can't talk to me without turning me into a supporting character in her story, then we don't need to be on the phone." Thomas said, "That sounds harsh." And I replied, "It sounds like a boundary. And those are different things." I continued. "Third, I want one more meeting after this. Back home or here. With Grandma and Marilyn sitting in, where we actually lay this out without pretending everything was fine until today." Diane winced and said, "You want your grandmother and your aunt to referee how we talk to you." "Is that what this is?" I said. "I want witnesses. Because when it's just the three of us, history has a way of getting rewritten into something softer and more convenient for you." Thomas said, "We can agree to the calls. We can agree to let you finish a sentence. We can sit down again with them there. But you have to meet us halfway." I shook my head and answered, "Halfway is what I've been doing for 30 years. This is me stepping back to my side and saying, you're welcome to walk toward me if you actually intend to." Brianna's voice came out small as she said, I'm sorry, Megan. I honestly didn't realize how much attention was tilting my way. I thought you liked being low-key. I looked at her and said, liking privacy and being erased are not the same thing. And you benefited from not having to think about which one I was living with. She swallowed and said, I want to be a better sister. I don't want to be the reason you feel like the extra in your own family. I replied, then start by not asking Mom and Dad to speak for you. If you have something to say to me, use your own voice. Grandma Ruth straightened as much as her back would allow and said, Diane. Tom. You did not lose a daughter by accident. You sidelined her because it was easier to pour everything into the one who soaked it up. Diane whispered, we never meant to push her aside. And Grandma answered, intentions don't weigh as much as patterns. And the pattern is standing right in front of you holding the title to a house you didn't know she owned. Thomas looked at me and said, we want to be in your life. Megan, we want another chance. I met his eyes and said, I'm not going to open the door to my life just because you're drowning in guilt. I will let you in if and when your behavior proves I'm not invisible to you anymore. They left that afternoon with promises hanging in the air. And once the last car pulled away, the house settled back into the kind of quiet I actually liked. A few hours later, my phone lit up with my mother's name, the screen bright against the dim hallway, and I watched it ring until it went to voicemail. When it started again with my father's name, I let it roll over too, the sound of it fading while the walls around me stayed steady. I wasn't interested in a sprint of panicked apologies before they had done any of the work they said they were willing to do. The next morning, a text from Brianna waited on my screen. Can I come down sometime? Just me? No, parents. I want to see your place and figure out how to actually know you. I stared at it for a long minute and finally typed back, maybe. I need time to think about what that would look like. She replied, I get it. I'll be here when you're ready to tell me yes or no. And for once, she didn't follow it up with a photo or a joke. For the first time in a long time, I could feel her reaching for me without asking our parents to hold the line for her. Later that week, Greg texted a photo of a stair rail on one of his job sites with the message, not as good as yours. But it'll do. You handled today with more grace than most people I know. I wrote back, thanks for seeing me when it wasn't trendy. And he answered, kid, I've been proud of you since before Savannah was even on the map. Keep sending me progress pics. Grandma Ruth's message arrived as a short, careful line. You built something strong here. Don't let anyone treat it like an afterthought, including us. I replied, I won't, but I'm open to you coming back. And she sent back a simple, good. That night I sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea, listening to the low hum of the neighborhood and the creak of the boards under my feet. The house around me was paid for by the hours I had logged in dim control rooms and quiet offices, the decisions I had made when no one was clapping, and the life I had built without anyone narrating it for me. Whether my parents ever learned how to see me properly or not, this place, this work, this piece belonged to me. I was done asking anyone else to validate that it was real. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it resonated, I hope you find the courage to choose peace, protect your heart, and build a life that feels like home. I'm grateful you're here. Please like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from.